The woman nobody listened to was about to save a company from the mistake everyone else applauded. The sentence would be repeated for years afterward, whispered in boardrooms and executive lounges whenever someone wanted to remind a room full of powerful people that confidence and wisdom were not always the same thing. But on that gray October morning in Manhattan, nobody knew it yet. Rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Blackwell Global Headquarters, turning the skyline into a watercolor of steel and glass. On the 42nd floor, the executive conference room glowed beneath warm lights and polished oak. The air carried the scent of fresh coffee, expensive cologne, and nervous anticipation. A deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars was only hours away from becoming official. Around the massive conference table sat some of the most influential business leaders in the country. Men and women whose signatures could move markets. People who were accustomed to being heard the moment they spoke. At the head of the table sat Ethan Blackwell. At 38 years old, he had built a reputation for seeing opportunities where others saw obstacles. Investors admired him. Competitors feared him. Employees respected him. But there was one flaw Ethan rarely noticed in himself. He tended to assume that the smartest person in any room was usually the one speaking the loudest. As executives reviewed documents and exchanged opinions, another figure moved quietly around the room. Claire Whitmore carried a silver coffee pot in one hand and a tray of ceramic cups in the other. Her black uniform blended into the background so perfectly that most people barely looked at her. She moved with calm precision, refilling cups before anyone asked, clearing papers that had drifted toward the edge of the table, adjusting water glasses with almost invisible efficiency. She seemed like part of the furniture. Useful, necessary, forgettable. That was exactly how most people saw her. One executive accepted a refill without looking up. Another continued a conversation while speaking directly over her shoulder as if she were not standing there. Claire never reacted. She simply nodded, offered a polite smile, and continued working. Her silence had become something of a reputation inside the building. Some employees thought she was shy. Others assumed she lacked confidence. A few believed she simply had nothing important to say. Claire let them believe whatever they wanted. Across the room, a burst of laughter interrupted the discussion. One of the visiting directors leaned back in his chair and gestured casually toward Claire. "You know," he said, smiling at the others. "I've been coming here for almost 6 months, and I still haven't heard her say more than 3 words." Several people chuckled. Another executive joined in. "Maybe she's figured out the secret to surviving corporate meetings." More laughter followed. Even Ethan allowed himself a faint smile before returning his attention to the contract in front of him. Claire continued pouring coffee. Calm, steady, unbothered. Yet behind her quiet eyes, she noticed everything. Every number, every expression, every detail others overlooked. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, the meeting moved closer and closer toward a decision that would change far more than anyone in that room could imagine. While the executives returned their attention to projections and revenue forecasts, Claire quietly moved toward the side counter where fresh coffee waited beneath polished steel warmers. The room saw a waitress. Nothing more. Nobody noticed the small notebook resting beside her bag in the service station outside the conference room. Nobody knew it contained years of observations, business articles, economic analyses, and handwritten notes collected during late nights after work. Claire had always found it strange how quickly people made decisions about one another. A uniform became an identity. A title became intelligence. A salary became value. The assumptions were almost automatic. She poured another cup and glanced toward the giant screen at the front of the room. Charts glowed across the display. Numbers climbed upward in neat columns. Executives nodded with confidence. Yet something about the discussion felt unsettled. Small inconsistencies floated through the conversation like dust in sunlight. Most people ignored them. Claire did not. Ethan stood and walked toward the screen. His presence immediately commanded attention. Conversations stopped. Pens paused. Eyes followed him. He spoke with the calm certainty of someone accustomed to leading difficult negotiations. The acquisition would expand Blackwell Global into new international markets. Investors were enthusiastic. Analysts had praised the opportunity. Everything appeared to be moving exactly as planned. Around the table, agreement came easily. Perhaps too easily. Claire noticed that as well. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city skyline. The sound was distant enough to be gentle. Inside, the atmosphere remained warm and confident. A dangerous combination, though nobody seemed to realize it. Ethan asked for final feedback before the afternoon session with the foreign partners. One executive complimented the legal team. Another praised the projected growth. A third predicted record profits within 18 months. More nodding followed. More agreement. Claire carried an empty tray toward the door. Then she heard something. Not a dramatic revelation. Not a shocking confession. Just a brief exchange between two senior advisors discussing a translated section of the agreement. The conversation lasted less than 10 seconds. Neither advisor appeared concerned. Yet Claire slowed her steps. Her attention sharpened. The phrase echoed in her mind. She had seen similar language before. Years ago, in another life. She glanced back toward the conference table. Ethan was speaking again. Confident. Focused. Completely unaware that a tiny detail buried inside hundreds of pages might alter everything. Claire felt a familiar sensation she had not experienced in a long time. Instinct. The quiet warning that appeared whenever something did not fit. She looked down at the coffee pot in her hands. Then back at the executives. The easy choice was to leave. Continue working. Stay invisible. That was what everyone expected. After all, nobody had asked for her opinion. Nobody wanted her opinion. She was the woman who refilled cups and cleared plates. Nothing more. At least that was what the room believed. Claire lowered her eyes and continued walking toward the exit. But the uneasy feeling remained, growing stronger with every step. And somewhere deep inside, a question refused to leave her alone. What happens when the person everyone ignores is the only one who notices the problem? Claire stepped into the hallway, but she did not go far. The conference room door remained slightly open behind her, allowing fragments of conversation to drift into the corridor. She set the coffee pot on a service cart and stood still for a moment. The uneasy feeling had not disappeared. If anything, it had become stronger. Through the glass wall, she could see Ethan Blackwell speaking with the confidence that had helped him build one of the most respected firms in the country. He looked exactly like the kind of leader business magazines loved to feature on their covers. Sharp suit, precise words, absolute certainty. Yet certainty had a way of becoming dangerous when nobody challenged it. Inside the room, the executives continued discussing timelines, regulatory approvals, and projected growth. Every answer seemed ready before the question was even finished. Claire watched several heads nod in agreement. Nobody appeared concerned. Nobody appeared cautious. She had seen this before. Years ago, long before she wore a service uniform, she had sat in rooms that looked remarkably similar. Different company, different city, different life, but the same atmosphere, the same confidence, the same assumption that success automatically protected people from mistakes. Her eyes drifted toward a stack of printed documents resting near the conference room entrance. One page had slipped slightly from the pile. Only a few lines were visible. Claire recognized the section immediately. Her heartbeat slowed. Not from fear. From focus. The language was familiar. International agreements often looked straightforward on the surface, while hiding critical obligations inside carefully chosen wording. A single phrase could shift responsibility. A single sentence could change who carried risk. Most people never noticed. That was why lawyers existed. Yet even lawyers sometimes missed things when everyone became eager for a deal to succeed. Claire looked away. This was not her responsibility. She reminded herself of that several times. She worked for the hospitality contractor assigned to the building. Her job was coffee service. Nothing more. If she walked away now, nobody would question her decision. Nobody would even know she had noticed anything. Across the room, Ethan checked his watch. The foreign delegation would arrive in less than an hour. Final signatures were expected before evening. The company was already celebrating internally. Claire could sense it. People moved differently when they believed victory was certain. They relaxed. They overlooked details. They stopped asking difficult questions. A young assistant entered the conference room carrying additional folders. One slipped from her hands and landed near the doorway. Claire instinctively stepped forward and picked it up. As she handed it back, her eyes caught a brief glimpse of a translated appendix attached near the back. Just one page. Just one paragraph. But it was enough. The uneasy feeling crystallized into certainty. Claire immediately understood what had been bothering her. The wording was not saying what everyone believed it was saying. The difference was subtle, almost invisible, yet the financial consequences could be enormous. The assistant thanked her and hurried away without noticing the change in Claire's expression. For the first time all morning, Claire felt genuinely conflicted. She had spent years learning how to stay invisible, years teaching herself not to get involved. Yet as the conference room buzzed with optimism behind the glass, one thought continued repeating itself inside her mind. If everyone in that room was wrong, how much longer could she stay silent? The clock on the conference room wall moved closer to noon. Every minute seemed to increase the momentum inside the building. Assistants hurried through hallways carrying folders. Department heads exchanged optimistic updates. Phones rang. Doors opened and closed. The entire floor felt like it was preparing for a celebration that had already been decided. Claire stood beside the service station, staring through the glass wall at the executives gathered around the table. Her reflection hovered faintly against the window. A woman in a black uniform. Blonde hair tied neatly back. A silver name tag pinned to her collar. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she belonged in a discussion involving international acquisitions and corporate strategy. That was precisely why nobody paid attention to her. Ethan reviewed final talking points with his leadership team. Confidence radiated from every word. He had spent months negotiating this agreement. Entire divisions had contributed research. Consultants had analyzed projections. Legal experts had reviewed documentation. The deal represented thousands of hours of work. The possibility that something fundamental had been overlooked seemed almost impossible. Yet Claire knew experience did not eliminate mistakes. Sometimes it made them harder to see. She remembered another conference room years earlier. Another team convinced they had everything under control. Another agreement everyone praised until a single overlooked clause transformed a promising opportunity into a costly lesson. The memory surfaced unexpectedly. Not painful, just clear, sharp, educational. Claire pushed it aside and focused on the present. Through the glass, she noticed one of the directors joking again. The man pointed toward an empty coffee cup and laughed as several colleagues joined him. The atmosphere remained light, comfortable. Nobody sensed danger. Nobody sensed uncertainty. The foreign delegation was scheduled to arrive within 30 minutes. Once they entered the room, events would begin moving quickly. Introductions, presentations, final reviews, signatures, cameras, handshakes, public announcements. After that, correcting the problem would become infinitely more difficult. Claire looked down at her hands. For years, she had built a life around staying unnoticed. There was safety in that. Simplicity. Peace. When people expected nothing from you, they rarely demanded explanations. They rarely asked about your past. They rarely questioned your decisions. She had grown accustomed to that quiet existence. Yet today felt different. The translated appendix remained fixed in her thoughts. Every time she replayed the language, the concern became more obvious. It was not merely a technical issue. It changed the interpretation of responsibility after the acquisition closed. Millions of dollars could eventually depend upon a distinction that almost nobody appeared to recognize. The elevator doors opened at the far end of the corridor. Several members of the international delegation stepped out accompanied by legal advisors and interpreters. Conversations immediately became more formal. Ethan straightened his jacket. Executives gathered their documents. Smiles appeared. The moment had arrived. Claire watched as people moved toward the conference room entrance. Excitement filled the air. She should have walked away. She should have returned to her routine and allowed the meeting to proceed. Instead, she remained standing beside the service cart, watching the room fill with powerful people preparing to make an important decision. And as the final guests took their seats, Claire realized that the opportunity to speak was slowly disappearing. The conference room doors closed softly behind the last guest. The sound seemed insignificant, yet Claire felt it like a countdown reaching its final stage. Around the table, introductions began. Business cards exchanged hands. Polite smiles appeared. Interpreters prepared their notes. The atmosphere carried the polished confidence of people accustomed to negotiating deals that shaped industries. Ethan stood near the presentation screen, welcoming the delegation with practiced ease. Every word landed exactly where it was supposed to. Every gesture projected certainty. The room trusted him. That trust had been earned through years of success. Yet success sometimes created a dangerous illusion. It convinced people that past victories guaranteed future ones. Claire remained near the service station along the wall, refilling water glasses and replacing empty coffee cups. Invisible, or at least almost invisible. One member of the visiting delegation thanked her politely. Another barely acknowledged her presence. Most never looked up at all. The discussion moved forward. Revenue projections appeared on the screen. Market expansion opportunities followed. Charts climbed upward in neat lines. Optimism spread around the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Then came the legal review. Thick folders opened simultaneously around the table. Attorneys discussed regulatory frameworks. Compliance specialists confirmed procedures. Several executives relaxed visibly. This was the section everyone expected to be routine. The section people often paid the least attention to because they assumed someone else had already examined every detail. Claire felt her concern deepen. She watched pages turn. She watched signatures being prepared. She watched people move closer and closer to a decision built upon an assumption she knew was incorrect. One director laughed quietly and glanced toward her while reaching for another cup of coffee. "You know," he said to the group, "I think she has heard every major negotiation in this building and still refuses to offer an opinion." A few people smiled. Another executive added, "Probably the smartest strategy in corporate America." More laughter followed. Even some members of the delegation joined politely. Claire simply offered a courteous smile and continued pouring coffee. Ethan barely looked up from the documents in front of him. "Trust me," one executive continued, joking. "If I had attended fewer meetings over the last 20 years, my career might actually be better." The room laughed again. Harmless, casual. Yet beneath the humor rested a familiar assumption. The belief that silence meant absence. The belief that quiet people had nothing worth hearing. Claire lowered the coffee pot and stepped back toward the wall. Her expression remained calm. Years earlier, remarks like that might have bothered her. Not anymore. Experience had taught her that underestimation often revealed more about the observer than the person being observed. Across the room, Ethan received confirmation from one of the lead attorneys. Everything appeared ready. The final review would begin in minutes. Pens were placed beside signature pages. Advisors exchanged satisfied nods. The deal stood only a few steps away from becoming official. Claire felt her pulse slow. Not accelerate. Slow. The way it always did when a difficult decision approached. She looked once more toward the translated appendix resting among the documents. Then she looked at Ethan. Then at the delegation. The room was moving forward with complete confidence. And for the first time that morning, Claire realized she could no longer convince herself that staying silent was the responsible choice. Claire took a slow breath and looked away from the conference table. The easiest decision would have been to leave the room and forget what she had seen. In a few hours, the deal would be announced. Reporters would write headlines. Investors would celebrate. Nobody would ever know that she had stood a few feet away carrying a coffee pot while questioning a detail buried deep inside the agreement. Yet the thought refused to disappear. She returned to the service counter and organized a stack of cups that did not need organizing. Her hands moved automatically. Her mind did not. Through the glass wall, she watched the legal teams begin their final review. The lead attorney pointed to several sections and received immediate approval. Pages turned. Notes were exchanged. Everything continued moving forward. Claire remembered the exact wording from the appendix. Not because she had memorized it intentionally, but because language had always stayed with her. Certain phrases carried consequences hidden beneath ordinary words. Most people read what they expected to see. Claire had learned to read what was actually there. The distinction had changed her life more than once. Ethan listened as advisors summarized the final terms. He appeared calm, though years of leadership had taught him to hide pressure behind composure. The acquisition represented one of the largest strategic moves his company had attempted. Success would strengthen the firm's position for years. Failure was not something anyone around the table seemed willing to imagine. That certainty bothered Claire more than the clause itself. Confident people still asked questions. Wise people still doubted their assumptions. But the room had stopped doubting. The room had already decided it was correct. Outside, rain streaked down the windows in silver lines. The city beyond appeared blurred and distant. For a moment, Claire found herself staring at the skyline. 5 years earlier, she had occupied a different world. A world of negotiations, presentations, and conference calls stretching late into the night. A world where every word inside a contract mattered. She rarely thought about that life anymore. There was too much history attached to it. Too many memories she preferred to leave behind. Yet today those old skills were refusing to stay buried. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me." Claire turned. One of the younger analysts stood beside the service station, holding an empty cup. "Could I get a refill?" he asked politely. "Of course," Claire replied. The analyst smiled. "Thank you. This meeting feels like it has lasted forever." Claire returned the smile and poured fresh coffee. "Important meetings usually do." The analyst laughed lightly and headed back toward the conference room. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it reminded Claire of something simple. Not everyone inside the room was arrogant. Not everyone deserved the consequences of a mistake they could not see. Her eyes drifted back toward the documents. The signature pages were now visible. Advisors were preparing them. The final stage had begun. Claire felt the familiar conflict one last time. Stay silent and remain invisible. Speak and risk everything. For several seconds, she stood completely still. Then her gaze settled on the translated appendix again. And in that moment, the decision she had been avoiding all morning finally became impossible to postpone. The room moved steadily toward the moment of commitment. Signature folders rested beside polished pens. Advisors reviewed final checklists. Interpreters exchanged quiet confirmations. Everything appeared orderly. Everything appeared certain. Claire looked at the conference room door and knew that if she walked through it now, there would be no way to return to being invisible. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it brought an unexpected calm. She lifted the coffee pot and entered the room once more. Nobody paid much attention. They were too focused on the deal, too focused on the future they believed was already secured. Claire moved around the table, refilling cups one final time. As she approached the foreign delegation, she listened carefully. A senior representative was discussing post-acquisition obligations with one of the attorneys. The attorney nodded confidently and repeated an interpretation that sounded reassuring to everyone present. Claire felt her concern harden into certainty. The interpretation was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not obviously wrong, but wrong enough to change who would bear responsibility if specific performance targets were not met after the acquisition closed. Millions of dollars could eventually depend on that distinction. Ethan accepted a document from his legal counsel and glanced through the final pages. Around him, executives exchanged smiles. One director was already talking about the press release scheduled for later that afternoon. Another was discussing investor reactions. The outcome felt inevitable. Claire stopped beside the far end of the table. For a brief moment, she simply stood there holding the coffee pot. One executive noticed her and gestured casually toward an empty chair near the wall. "You can leave the service items there," he said without looking up. Claire nodded politely. Then she remained where she was. The executive finally glanced at her. "Is everything all right?" Several people looked up, only for a second. Then most returned to their documents. Claire could still walk away. Nobody expected her to say anything. Nobody expected her to matter. Ethan noticed the hesitation and looked in her direction. His expression carried mild impatience. Not hostility. Simply the focus of a man trying to keep an important meeting moving forward. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Did you need something?" The room grew slightly quieter. Claire felt dozens of eyes shift toward her. For years she had avoided moments exactly like this. Years spent choosing silence over attention. Yet now silence felt heavier than speaking. She looked at the translated appendix resting near the center of the table. Then she looked directly at Ethan Blackwell. The room waited. Some appeared confused. Others mildly amused. One executive even smiled as though expecting an apology about coffee service. Instead, Claire spoke. Her voice was calm, clear, steady. "Before anyone signs," she said, "you may want to review the liability language in the translated appendix again, because it does not say what everyone in this room thinks it says." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. The effect was immediate. Conversation stopped. Pens froze above paper. Even the rain outside seemed distant. For the first time all morning, the conference room became completely silent. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier seemed to evaporate into the silence. Ethan stared at Claire as though seeing her for the first time. Not as a waitress. Not as part of the background. as a person who had just interrupted a multi-million-dollar transaction with a statement nobody had expected to hear. One of the attorneys broke the silence first. "I am sorry," he said carefully. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Claire did not rush to answer. She set the coffee pot down on the nearest side table and folded her hands calmly in front of her. The room watched her. Executives, lawyers, advisors, interpreters. Every eye seemed fixed on the woman they had spent the entire morning ignoring. Claire looked toward the appendix. The translation assumes that operational liability remains shared during the first performance cycle after acquisition, she said. But that is not what the original language establishes. Several attorneys immediately frowned. Pages began turning. Pens moved. A member of the foreign delegation leaned forward. Ethan remained silent. His attention never left Claire. "The wording shifts responsibility after the first compliance review," Claire continued. "Not before. That changes who absorbs the financial exposure if targets are missed." The lead attorney quickly located the section and adjusted his glasses. Around him, other legal specialists did the same. The atmosphere changed instantly. Casual confidence disappeared. Concentration replaced it. One executive laughed nervously. "Surely our legal team already reviewed that." Nobody responded. Ethan noticed that. The attorney continued reading. Then he read the paragraph again, this time more slowly. Claire recognized the exact moment doubt entered the room. It appeared first in the attorney's eyes, then in the eyes of the advisors seated beside him. The foreign representative exchanged a brief look with his interpreter. Ethan noticed that as well. "Show me," Ethan said quietly. The attorney handed him the appendix. Ethan read the section, then read it again. The room remained silent except for the soft sound of pages turning. Rain continued sliding down the windows beyond the skyline. Finally, one of the international attorneys spoke. The original language does support her interpretation. Several heads turned immediately. Another advisor reviewed the text and nodded reluctantly. "I believe he is correct." Ethan looked back toward Claire. "How did you catch this?" The question hung in the air. Claire hesitated for only a moment. "Because everyone was reading what they expected to see," she answered. "I read what was actually written." No one laughed. No one smiled. The words landed with uncomfortable precision. Around the table, executives who had joked about her silence earlier now sat completely still. The director who had mocked her only minutes ago lowered his eyes toward the documents in front of him. Ethan studied Claire carefully. There was no arrogance in her voice. No attempt to embarrass anyone. No desire to prove herself superior. Only calm certainty. Somehow that made the moment even more powerful. For the first time since the meeting began, Ethan felt something he had not expected to feel that day. Uncertainty. And for the first time, he began to wonder who Claire Whitmore really was. The conference room no longer felt like the same room. Only 15 minutes earlier it had been filled with certainty. Now every document seemed heavier. Every assumption seemed fragile. The lead attorneys spread copies of the appendix across the table, while legal specialists from both sides compared translations line by line. Nobody spoke casually anymore. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody joked about coffee or long meetings. Claire remained standing near the side wall, where she had spent most of the day unnoticed. Yet somehow she had become the center of attention without trying. Ethan closed the folder in front of him and leaned back slightly. His eyes remained fixed on Claire. The question continued echoing in his mind. Who was she? Not because she had noticed an error. Smart people noticed errors all the time. It was the way she had done it. Calmly. Precisely. Without hesitation. Without needing recognition. Most people who wanted attention rushed to prove themselves. Claire seemed almost uncomfortable receiving it. Across the table, one of the international attorneys finally broke the silence. She is correct. The statement landed like a stone in still water. Ripples spread instantly around the room. Another attorney nodded. If this language remains unchanged, liability shifts after the first compliance review. That exposure would belong entirely to Blackwell Global. Several executives exchanged uneasy looks. One director quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another stared at the contract as though hoping the words might somehow change. Ethan remained composed, but inside he felt a growing sense of disbelief. Dozens of professionals had reviewed these documents. Highly paid experts, experienced negotiators, entire legal teams. Yet the person who identified the problem had been carrying a coffee pot. The irony was impossible to ignore. How significant is the exposure? Ethan asked. The lead attorney answered carefully. Potentially tens of millions of dollars, depending on performance metrics and market conditions. Silence followed. This time it was not surprise. It was realization. The room was beginning to understand what had almost happened. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. She took no satisfaction in it. Mistakes were rarely victories. They were warnings. Opportunities to correct course before consequences arrived. One executive finally looked toward her. The same executive who had joked about her silence earlier. His expression had changed completely. You saw this from one glance, he asked. Claire shook her head slightly. Not from one glance. From several conversations. A few pages. And the wording itself. The executive frowned. Most people would not have caught it. Claire offered a small, polite smile. Most people were not looking for it. No arrogance. No criticism. Just a simple observation. Ethan noticed that as well. She never tried to embarrass anyone. Even now, when she had every reason to enjoy the moment, she remained respectful. That impressed him more than the discovery itself. The legal teams continued reviewing the agreement. Corrections were already being discussed. New drafts would be required before signatures could proceed. The deal was not collapsing. It was being saved. Yet another question had quietly emerged around the table. The contract problem was no longer the only mystery in the room. Claire Whitmore had become one as well. And as Ethan watched her standing calmly beside the conference room wall, he realized that uncovering her story might prove far more interesting than the acquisition itself. The meeting paused for nearly an hour while attorneys from both sides revised language, compared interpretations, and rebuilt sections of the agreement that only minutes earlier had seemed untouchable. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. Sunlight pushed through the clouds and reflected against the glass towers surrounding Blackwell Global. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere had changed completely. Nobody viewed details as routine anymore. Nobody assumed certainty. Claire quietly resumed collecting empty cups. She hoped attention would return to the deal and away from her. Instead, the opposite happened. Every time she moved, someone seemed to notice. Every time she spoke, people listened. The change felt strange. Uncomfortable, even. She preferred being overlooked. It was simpler that way. Ethan watched her from across the room while reviewing the revised documents. The more he thought about what had happened, the less it made sense. Expertise left clues. Certain habits. Certain vocabulary. Certain instincts. Claire had demonstrated all of them. Yet she worked as a waitress. The two realities refused to fit together. Finally, during a short break in the negotiations, Ethan closed his folder and stood. Conversations softened as he crossed the room. Claire was placing clean cups onto a service tray when she noticed him approaching. Miss Whitmore, he said, may I ask you something? Claire looked up. Of course. Ethan paused for a moment. Not because he lacked confidence. Because he was choosing his words carefully. How does someone working in hospitality recognize a contractual issue that several legal teams missed? The room grew quiet again. Not silent. Just attentive. Claire knew the question everyone wanted answered. She considered avoiding it. Then she realized there was little point. Because I spent years reviewing international agreements before I ever carried a coffee tray, she said. Several people exchanged surprised glances. Ethan remained focused. You worked in corporate law? Claire shook her head. Strategic negotiations. Cross-border acquisitions. Risk assessment. Nobody spoke. The answer seemed to create more questions than it resolved. Ethan studied her expression. There was no sign of exaggeration. No attempt to impress anyone. She was simply stating facts. Then why are you here? He asked. For the first time all afternoon, Claire hesitated. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Familiar. Distant. Life does not always follow the plan we create for it, she said quietly. A few years ago, my father became seriously ill. I left my position to help take care of him. After he passed away, returning to my old career felt impossible. Too much had changed. So I chose something simpler. The room listened carefully. There was no dramatic tragedy in her voice. No request for sympathy. Only acceptance. Ethan noticed that too. Most people used difficult experiences to explain themselves. Claire used them to understand herself. And you never went back? He asked. Claire offered a small smile. I stopped looking backward. The answer lingered in the room long after she finished speaking. because somehow it revealed more about her than a resume ever could. And as Ethan returned to his seat, he found himself thinking about something far more important than the acquisition. He was thinking about how many extraordinary people passed through life unnoticed simply because nobody bothered to look beyond the uniform. The revised contract now sat in front of every person in the room like a reminder of how close they had come to a costly oversight. Pages had been replaced. Clauses had been corrected. Legal language had been carefully rewritten to reflect the original intent rather than the flawed translation. The urgency of the moment had shifted from crisis to correction, but the weight of what had almost happened remained in the air. Ethan sat at the head of the table, reviewing the final version line by line. His expression was controlled, yet his focus was sharper than before. The realization that a single unnoticed detail could have changed the financial structure of the entire deal had created a silence that no one seemed eager to break. Around the table, executives no longer spoke in confident assumptions. They spoke in careful confirmations. Every sentence was checked. Every interpretation was questioned. Claire stood slightly apart from the group, no longer moving between chairs or refilling cups. The coffee pot rested on the service cart behind her. For the first time since the meeting began, she was no longer invisible. She was being observed, not as staff, as something else entirely. One of the senior executives finally broke the silence. If Miss Whitmore had not pointed this out, we would have signed under entirely different conditions. The statement was not dramatic. It was factual, and somehow that made it more powerful. A few heads turned toward Claire again. The same people who had joked about her earlier now looked at her with restrained disbelief. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "How certain are you about this interpretation?" he asked the legal team. The lead attorney exhaled slowly. Completely certain now? She was correct. The liability shift was embedded in the translated section in a way that is easy to miss if you assume consistency with standard contract structure. Ethan nodded once. Slowly. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked toward Claire. The room followed his gaze. Claire felt the attention settle on her again, heavier this time. Not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar. Ethan spoke carefully. "You prevented a significant financial error today." Claire responded calmly. "I only pointed out what was already there." A pause followed. The kind of pause that happens when people realize they are no longer in control of the narrative. One of the visiting representatives from the foreign delegation finally spoke through an interpreter. "In our experience, details like this are usually caught during final arbitration review. It is unusual for someone outside the legal team to notice it so quickly." Ethan turned slightly toward Claire. "You are not part of the legal team." It was not a question. Claire shook her head. No, another silence followed. This one deeper, more thoughtful. Ethan studied her for a long moment. There was something unresolved in his expression. Not suspicion, not doubt. Something closer to curiosity that had become too strong to ignore. "Then what exactly are you?" he asked. The question lingered in the air longer than intended. Claire did not answer immediately. She looked down at the service card, then back toward the table filled with executives and attorneys who now waited for her response. The answer, if she were honest, was complicated. Too complicated for a conference room. Too long for a single sentence. But for the first time that day, she realized that staying silent would no longer protect her from being seen. For a moment after Ethan's question, the room felt suspended between expectation and hesitation. Claire stood still beside the service card, aware that every person in the conference room was waiting for her response. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was focused, intentional. Ethan did not look away. Neither did the attorneys. Even the members of the visiting delegation watched her closely now, as though a single sentence from her might reveal something far beyond contract language. Claire understood the shift. Once people begin to see you clearly, they stop accepting simple explanations. She took a slow breath. "I am not part of your legal team," she said calmly, "and I am not here in any official capacity related to this agreement." A few executives exchanged glances, uncertain where the answer was leading. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpened. Claire continued, "I used to work in international contract analysis, specifically cross-border acquisitions and risk interpretation." The statement changed the atmosphere again. Subtle, but immediate. One of the attorneys looked down at the documents with renewed curiosity. Another quietly adjusted his notes, as if reevaluating everything he had assumed earlier. Ethan's expression shifted, though only slightly. Not surprise anymore. Recognition of something he had not yet fully defined. Used to, he repeated. Claire nodded once. Yes. The room waited for more. When none came immediately, Ethan spoke again. Why would someone with that background be working here? The question was not judgmental. It was genuinely searching. Claire did not rush her answer. She had learned long ago that truth spoken too quickly often sounded defensive, even when it was not. Because life does not always allow people to continue on the paths they plan, she said. Sometimes circumstances change what is possible. A quiet murmur moved through the room. No one interrupted her. Claire continued, her tone steady. After leaving my previous role, I needed something stable that did not require the same level of commitment or travel. I chose work that allowed me to stay grounded while managing personal responsibilities. Ethan studied her carefully. And you chose hospitality. I chose stability, Claire corrected gently. The distinction was subtle, but it mattered. One of the executives who had previously joked about her now looked down at the table, visibly uncomfortable. The realization of how casually they had dismissed her earlier seemed to settle in. Ethan leaned back slowly. For the first time since the meeting began, he was not focused on the contract. He was focused on her. You understand what you prevented today, he said. It was not a question. Claire nodded. Yes. And you understand the scale of what could have happened if this had gone unnoticed. Yes. Another pause followed. Ethan glanced briefly at the attorneys, then back at Claire. People with your level of expertise do not typically disappear into roles like this, he said. Claire met his gaze evenly. People do not disappear, she replied. They adapt. The answer landed with quiet finality. No emotion, no complaint, just observation. Ethan looked down at the documents again, then slowly closed the folder in front of him. When he spoke again, his tone had changed slightly. Less formal, more personal. Miss Whitmore, he said, I would like you to stay for the remainder of this meeting. Claire hesitated, not because she was unsure, because she understood what that request meant. She nodded once. All right. Around the table, the executives adjusted their posture again. The meeting had not ended, but something fundamental about it had changed. And everyone in the room now understood the same quiet truth. The person they had almost ignored was no longer someone they could afford to overlook. The final hours of the meeting unfolded in a quieter rhythm, as if the entire room had collectively decided to slow down and rethink every assumption that had been made earlier that morning. The contract was no longer treated as a formality. Every line was reviewed with care. Every clause was questioned with a level of attention that had not existed before Claire spoke. Ethan remained seated at the head of the table, but his focus was no longer only on the documents. It occasionally shifted toward Claire, who stood near the side of the room observing without interrupting. There was no urgency in her presence now, only steadiness. The kind of steadiness that does not demand recognition but naturally earns it. One by one, the remaining uncertainties in the agreement were resolved. Adjustments were made. Clarifications were documented. The tone of the room gradually transformed from tension into resolution. Not excitement, not triumph. Something quieter, something more thoughtful. The visiting delegation finally agreed to the revised terms after extended confirmation with their legal advisors. No one rushed the decision. No one assumed anymore. When the final agreement was verbally acknowledged, there was a moment where nothing happened. No applause, no celebration, just a shared understanding that a mistake had been avoided rather than a victory achieved. Ethan closed the folder in front of him and leaned back slightly. His expression was composed, but different from before. The confidence was still there, but it had been tempered by awareness. He looked toward Claire. This time, there was no confusion in his eyes, only recognition. We would have signed it, he said quietly, exactly as it was. Claire did not respond immediately. She simply nodded once. No emphasis, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement of fact. Ethan stood and walked slowly toward her. The room gave him space without being asked. When he stopped a few feet away, his voice lowered slightly, carrying less authority and more sincerity. Today could have gone very differently, he said. Claire met his gaze. It did not, she replied. A faint pause followed. Ethan studied her for a long moment. Then, in a tone that surprised several people in the room, he said, You did not just notice a mistake. You prevented a major loss for this company. Claire's expression remained calm. I pointed out a correction, she said softly. The team implemented it. Ethan shook his head slightly. That is not what happened, he replied. You were the reason anyone looked again. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Honest. Around the room, people who had arrived that morning expecting a routine corporate meeting now sat with a different understanding of what they had witnessed. Not just a corrected contract, but a reminder of how easily certainty can become blindness. Ethan glanced briefly around the table, then back to Claire. This company does not forget contributions like this, he said. Claire responded with a small, respectful nod. I did not do it for recognition, she said. I did it because it was wrong. That simple sentence carried more weight than any presentation that had been given that day. Ethan looked at her for another moment, then extended his hand. Not as a formality, as respect. Claire hesitated briefly, then accepted. The handshake was brief, professional, final. When she released it, she stepped back slightly, returning to the place beside the service cart where she had stood earlier in the day. Yet the room no longer saw her as someone who belonged there only by accident. As the executives began gathering their belongings and the delegation prepared to leave, Ethan remained in place for a moment longer. The energy in the room had changed permanently. He knew that. Everyone knew that. Before exiting, he looked once more toward Claire. If you ever decide you are ready to return to what you were doing before, he said, you would have a place at this company. Claire met his gaze, then offered a quiet smile. I am already where I need to be, she replied. There was no regret in her voice, only peace. Ethan nodded once, as if accepting an answer that did not require further discussion. Then he turned and left the room with the others. The conference room slowly emptied. Footsteps faded into the hallway. Voices disappeared into the distance. Claire remained for a moment longer, looking out toward the city beyond the glass. The rain had fully stopped now. Light reflected across the buildings in soft layers, as if the skyline itself had been washed clean. She picked up the service card, adjusted it slightly, and prepared to leave the room as she always had. But this time, something was different. Not her surroundings, not her work, only the way she saw herself inside it. And for the first time in a long time, silence did not feel like absence. It felt like choice. If this story reminded you that quiet voices often carry the strongest truths, take a moment to share your thoughts below. And if you believe people like Claire deserve to be seen before they are understood, subscribe and stay with us for more stories that reveal the dignity hidden in unexpected places.